Welcome to another Museum FAQ video. I'm Paul Orselli, President and Chief Instigator at POW, Paul Orselli Workshop here on Long Island. And I'm delighted to welcome today Michelle Moon, who is doing extra duty from a hotel room in Little Rock, Arkansas, if I'm tracking all this. Hi, Michelle, how are you doing?
I'm doing really well. Thanks for having me on your Museum FAQ series, Paul.
Thanks, kind of you to join me. So, Michelle, I always like to ask the guest or guests when they are part of the show to tell us a little bit about their background before we launch into the main part of the conversation. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about your background in museums.
Sure. Well, my beginnings in museums really come from experiential education. That's kind of how I got my start on this wider path. As a young person, being a camp counselor, a ropes course instructor, an outdoor educator for a few years. You know, I was really involved in education programs that were just highly sensory, experiential, and engaged in lots of exploring and curiosity and discovery. And I thought that my path out of that was going to be in classroom education. So my first work was in school settings where I taught for the few years in the elementary grades, but I soon discovered that I really missed that tactile element, that element of adventure, discovery, freedom, and curiosity that I had loved in experiential education. So a friend introduced me to the world of museum education, which I had not heard of, had never even been mentioned in my education program. My undergraduate was not known as a field that might take educators in. So I gradually discovered the field through interning at first, volunteering, and eventually becoming an educator, starting out at Mystic Seaport in Connecticut. And then that was it for the next 20 years. I have remained in the world of museums, particularly museum education, growing in the direction of becoming a more interpretive specialist, in which I think about programs and education as one element of an interpretive an overall interpretive strategy. So I focus quite a bit on museum audiences, programs, exhibit interpretation, and all the ways that ideas can engage and excite people in museums. So I've worked at a few places like the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem and Strawberry Bank Museum, the Newark Museum of Art, and most recently the Tenement Museum, where I was at the time that COVID began. And as we'll probably talk more about, during the impact of COVID, that museum, like many museums, let the majority of its staff go, and I was in that wave. So I took that moment to launch a longtime dream of opening my own consulting practice. So that's what I've been working with for the past year or so. It's called Saltworks Interpretive Consulting, and I try to focus on museums that are looking to interpret food, place, and culture. So in a nutshell.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's great. Well, and one of the things that prompted me to ask you to come on today was a recent article that you wrote. Speaking of COVID and the impact on museums, and so your article has the I would say both evocative and provocative title of Retooling for the Revolution, Framing the Future of Museum Management After COVID-19. So I think you might have told us a little bit or indicated a little bit about why you would write such an article, but maybe just tell us a little bit about what your thinking was with this article, and then let's dig a little deeper into what your thinking is right now about the future of museum management.
Sure. Well, the beginnings of the article really lie in a Google spreadsheet, and it's a quite simple starting point. But when I found myself outside of museum employment, in really the first week or 2 weeks of the impact of COVID-19, it was like hearing the dominoes fall all around us, as we all remember. Those first few weeks, we were watching one institution after another make moves, really dramatic moves of reducing or eliminating staff, going on furlough, closure. It was really a chaotic period. It was the fog of war, as I've talked about in the piece. And I think we were all trying to find ways to understand the scope of what was happening, certainly at an individual level, but also at a field-wide level. And it became really clear, excuse me, right away that museums were in trouble because for so many, our reasons for existence and our business models had been built on the foot traffic of visitation, of school visit programming, of things that were clearly going away, not just in the short term, but for some time to come. And that was and still is an existential threat, as we saw early on when I think Laura Lott was one of the first to project that a third of museums might not make it through the crisis. So it was alarming. And I wanted that kind of broader understanding. And because we had this absence of data, there was really no way to take to assess what the impact was at the highest scale. I took inspiration from the spreadsheet, sort of, if you can call it a movement, but there have been lots of very useful spreadsheets in recent years, from the Me Too movement to our museum salary and transparency sheet.
Who would ever thought that Excel could be a social justice movement tool? But in a small way, I suppose it is a way for people to share information between each other about things they want to change.
Absolutely. I think that's been an inspiring thing, is to look at how these open platforms have allowed people to pool the little piece that they know and then develop a picture of what's going on more widely. So that's what I did. I created a simple Google spreadsheet and began to tally museums who had had some reaction, whether that was layoffs, furloughs, closures. There were reductions in effort, reductions in salary, restructurings, and so forth. So it was really high level, and it was also very messy, very grassroots. It was really reported from individual perspectives or from news stories, which I set up my Google alert, and every day I would get a few pieces in the news feed of another museum that had taken such a move, and would glean whatever I could from that. And the list eventually built to more than 200 museums. And the number of jobs impacted in whatever way, when you look at it in total, was more than 20,000 on the spreadsheet. And that to make that even worse, when I was engaged in conversation with people involved in the federal PPP grants and CARES loans, that sampling made it clear that we were only capturing maybe 1/5 of the total impact. So we really are seeing something that has changed the livelihoods of probably 1 or 2 out of 5 people in our profession in some way. So it's huge. And that really started to help me, and I think many others, realize not only did we need more granular and scientific data, but that we were looking at a fundamental moment of transition in this field.
Yeah, that's a lot of sobering information for sure. Does the spreadsheet, is it still active? Is it still accessible? What is the status of that spreadsheet?
It's accessible, but it's closed now. And the reason is, once the PPP loans kicked in and museums began to get on their feet and start making different immediate plans for how they were going to make it through, the data became a little more messy than we could really manage. So as people coming back off furlough, restructurings, it was very hard to reflect how that was changing the picture, because that information is even harder to get. So we just closed the spreadsheet as a snapshot of the immediate impact. And fortunately, that's where things dovetailed with more scientific work from the Culture Track COVID report that we can link to, that really took an assessment of where audiences and participation were. Americans for the Arts, AAM, all of these organizations have started to build a clearer picture of the overall impact. So kind of lets the grassroots scientists off the hook a little bit. But what happened after that was that that spreadsheet became the impetus for an invitation to write a piece for the Journal of Cultural Management and Cultural Policy. And that came to me through Gretchen Jennings and Sahava Deering, who were looking for content for a guest edited journal on this, the topic of management and COVID, so, and justice. So I took on that project, and it really became for me a way of making sense of this very, very chaotic time. As you see in the piece, I delved back into museum literature, into some of the thinking about the large scale shifts and changes that our field has been through over 100+ years, and how that might help us understand what's going on right now. So it was a real labor of love.
Yeah, well, obviously, well, you mentioned two things. We'll just take a pause for the cause, and you mentioned several references. So since we're in YouTube land, I'll say in the description below there will be links to Michelle's work and references relative to the conversation, of course. But let's dig into some of the things you touched on in the article that you just referenced. One thing that really stood out for me, and I think is maybe hopefully a positive beacon in terms of a way forward, is this notion of a more, I'm going to say, human-centered framework, or a human resources-centered framework, something that really shifts the emphasis to, as some people have said, staff over stuff, because it seems like so many of the decisions, and I will say, as a museum professional, hurtful language that was employed, articulating the core mission as protecting collections, and that everything outside that mission, including education work, staff work, what have you, was just sort of secondary to protecting this collections core. Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering if you can articulate how both how humans and the human-centered approach could really be part of the museum revolution that you have obviously been thinking about and also touched on in the article.
Yeah, I'm so glad that that resonated with you, and I agree that what happened was that language about the core revealed something. I think it revealed fundamental assumptions. There's an element of the Great Oz curtain whisking away, and you realize, maybe we never did truly let go of this notion that museums exist simply to preserve collections and collections information, and not to serve people. And I do mean people both within and without the organization, because this human-centered shift, I want to cast it in the light of the history of museums, and I'm a fan of the work that Jay Rounds has done in identifying these major periods of museum organization and what they focused on. And the museums, the model that we probably have come up in, and many people working today have come up in, is one that he called the cultural transmission model, where the museum owns the knowledge and owns the information and owns the stuff, and its role is to get it out to people. So under that regime, education, exhibitions, programs, school visits, all of the things that design work, all of the things that we try to do to get those messages and get those ideas into a space where they can interact with people, really ends up being considered ancillary to the fundamental purpose, which is to retain these objects of cultural transmission and the thinking that goes with them. And I think what's weird is that I know, as I came up through my museum studies training, and when we go to conferences, we hear all about this paradigm shift that museums were supposed to have made to really putting people at the center. And to Stephen Weil saying in the 90s, we need to go from about something to being for somebody. And I think many of us in the profession thought we were doing that. We thought that's where we were, but this moment of retrenchment sort of revealed, like, no, we're actually still going to pull back to that core understanding of why museums exist.
That paradigm has been shifting, as you say, for 30 or 40 years. The entire time I've been in the museum business. So, I don't know what to say about that other than what you just said. It's, well, I will say, talk is cheap, isn't it? That's what I'll say.
So yeah, exactly. I agree with you. We've talked about it for ages, but we haven't actually shifted. We actually haven't found that new gear, to strain the metaphor. So that, accepting that was probably an accurate picture of what was going on. I started to think about what a human-centered organization really would look like if we really believed that was our paradigm. What was missing, and what is it that was causing us to revert to these old organizational assumptions and structures and protections and investments? And it really became clear that part of our tradition has become the use of these frames of how we make management decisions that really are not sufficient to work in a human-centered way. If you spend time in progressive educational organizations, you really feel the difference as to how they're organized. They're really focused on users and learners. They learn from them, they learn with them, they're responsive to them, and they will shift resources as needed to make sure that people are receiving the intended impact. And I don't think many of our museums really feel that way. And in part, it's because I borrowed some thinking from Bowman and Deal, management theorists, who introduced this notion of 4 frames of management. And they include the structural frame and the political frame, both of which museums are excellent at. We've done really kind of imbibed a lot of thinking from the world of corporate business, from hierarchical management theories, from excellence and performance measurement. And I'm not here to downplay any of those things. I think they're essential. I use them. I'm a strategic manager. I like my tools. I think they're incredibly useful. But we're using these frames, and then the political frame, which is a lot about positioning an institution within power structures, making your friends among donors, your powerful board members, your political representative.
Yeah, museums are really good at that too.
So we like sharpened all those tools, and then we left this one back in the workshop and have not had it out. This tool of what they call the human resource frame. And by that, they don't mean the HR department. They mean the idea of really looking at humans as the source of all of the wonderful creativity, thinking, ideas, even the energy that does protect and preserve collections comes from people. I mean, museums are people in the end, and they serve people. And yet this whole array of skills and thoughts and practices around taking care of those people has not necessarily played a huge role in our management practices, in our strategic planning, in our resourcing, and our care for the individuals who work in museums. So I agree, our staff have borne the brunt of that lack of care, but I also really want to show how those two things are connected. If we're not able to care for and resource the staff that are doing the work that brings people in and gives them meaning and fulfills them, then we're also not fulfilling our goal as a museum institution, or our stated goal as a museum institution. So how can we make that more true? We need to really start investing more in human-centered management and human-centered museum practice.
So, yes. And how could we do some of those things? So maybe we could do 2 things here. Maybe if you could call out a museum or 2 that you think has navigated this COVID crisis in a more human-centered, or I'm going to say humane way, or with that human resources framework in mind. Maybe you could call out a couple of museums that you think could serve as examples for that approach. but then also talk to individual practitioners. You know, okay, that's great if you tell me about this museum, but what can I do? Somebody who lost my job, I want to make the museum business better. So no, just two small tasks I've given you here to wrap up the conversation. But nevertheless, if you, I think it's helpful to think of positive examples, and also what might be some action items that individual museum practitioners, whether they are currently employed in a museum or not, could be thinking about in this regard.
Yeah, in the article, I did some research on organizations that I thought were responding in a more humane way, just to surface examples. And we do need more of this. I have a few, and I'm on the alert for them, but I would love to learn about other places that have taken a stand in trying to retain these humane values, even as they weather a really difficult transition. So a couple of them that I talked about in the article, one is the National World War I Museum, where the director did some very creative thinking and redeployed the entire staff, working on 5 separate project areas. Some of them were quite infrastructure oriented, but one of them received a lot of media attention, and that was a digitization project where they put a huge swath of their staff together to digitize letters back to the home front from soldiers in World War I, now available for researchers, and the basis of a beautiful online exhibition. So that was an investment that I think will have returns for them over a very long time, not least in that the staff got to work together and got to work in a new way and create something very important together across their usual divisions. I also want to call out the Oakland Museum of California, who early on said, we are going to be closed, but we will be retaining our whole staff. Now, I know that meant some pain across the staff in that they did some salary reductions and hours reductions to make that possible, but they initially set out to work together as a group, and they have continued to do that. I'm not aware of what their very latest decisions are, but I think that they set a very important model for us in the early moments to say our people are valuable, our people are important, and we're going to care for them as we figure out what's next. Similarly, the Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation, where Christy Coleman used some very creative thinking in instituting rolling furloughs, and again, kind of spreading, rather than having one group bear the brunt, they sort of spread the resources across the entire staff to try to sustain as many people as they could. They gave a lot of consideration to how this interacted with the state unemployment system and the federal supplement, and really thought about what it meant to be a worker in this situation. And finally, I didn't discuss this in depth in the article, but Old Salem Museums and Gardens, Frank Vagnoni had there, really, I think, kind of took the bull by the horns and recognized this moment as one to create more of that fundamental transition around users and audience by really reimagining the museum as a learning platform. So they did do some layoffs and furloughs when it became unavoidable, but they also reorganized their work around delivering pretty incredible digital resources to learners across the state and beyond. And you can now see that in their learning in place programs online. So, they weren't able to avoid the pain, but what they did do was really reorganize the institution around people's needs as they are today. So those are some good examples. I hope that we'll start to hear of more and more as the stories come out as we kind of emerge.
Well, and I think one common thread there is, again, back to this human-centered focus when people, including museum people and museum management people were, I'm just going to say, panicking because nobody really knew what was going on. And that's completely understandable. But I think it is interesting to see where choices were made when that sort of initial burst of panic set in, where in some cases, education staff, front of house staff were almost immediately jettisoned, even before people knew about government aid programs. It's like, okay, we're just pushing these people off the boat, as opposed to organizations like the ones you mentioned who at that same time made a clear commitment and a statement that we want to do everything we can to protect our staff, as opposed to slough off our staff. Yeah. So I think, again, and I'll just say again, fog of war, as you mentioned, and a lot of panic and uncertainty. But I think in those moments, you also find what the core values of institutions and people are in difficult times, and whether they're was it staff over stuff or stuff over staff, what was the core, so-called core. But leaving my editorial aside, I'm wondering if you might be able to help us wrap up here with some suggestions for individual museum workers. And by that, I mean people who currently are employed in museums, or people like you and I who are independent museum professionals or adjacent to the museum field, but who still care about the museum field and who want to help the museum world change in positive ways. What could individuals concerned about the museum world be doing and thinking about this matter?
That's a great question. I think we're all making it up as we go along, but I'm going to attempt to tackle it with some initial thoughts. I mean, one thing I want to reflect on in response to your last comment about revealing what the core is, one of the things that's inspiring about these museums that went a different way is that it's not just that they were, they did this out of the goodness of their hearts and they don't want to be Ebenezer Scrooge. It's really not even that. It's so much that they understood their people are assets. Their educators, visitor services, front of house, these are people who are assets to the organization, who have knowledge, who have skills, who reflect and understand the visitor experience. So it's thinking about how do you use this capability to the best of its purpose. And that's what those organizations did. And those that did not, I think, may have limited their abilities to respond creatively. And we saw the wave of like throwing anything online without a thoughtful process that might have benefited from the presence of some of those people. So just to say that thinking about people as assets is number one. I think that's probably the core theme of the piece that I wrote is, we need to get into that mentality. So if you're a museum professional, inside or outside the organization, a museum worker of any kind, I think number one, it's really important to recognize this is a moment where things are shifting. And I know that sounds stupid because that's what we've been talking about this whole time, but really internalizing wherever you are in the employment realm, it is not about you. It's about an enormous reckoning with our traditions, our business models, and our assumptions that were already strained. We know that coming into the pandemic, we were already dealing with lots of institutional concerns, and it sort of became the snapping point. So we need to recognize that we are all engaged in a shift in the way our culture looks at and thinks about cultural organizations and their usefulness and who they exist for and who works within them. So just being aware of that, I think being really engaged, now is the time, if you care, to be engaged, to listen to video, podcasts, all of these things that you're working on and many of our peers are working on to put out thinking about where we are and where we're headed. For those that do manage resources in museums, I think really reading about and internalizing this notion of a human resources frame is essential. We've gone too long assuming that we don't have to treat people very well because there are always more coming down the pike, coming out of these museum studies programs, beating down the door to get in the institution. That has created sort of a sense of, just kind of deal with it, and you have to work, pay your dues.
We can get rid of these troublemakers because we can hire some new people cheap.
Maybe so. But I think we need to understand, yes, we do have really wonderful work to offer, but it is work and it needs to be treated with all the honor and dignity that work deserves. We do want people who care about the work and who are very mission driven, but we also want to treat them well. And some of the reactions that we saw people did not feel treated well. They felt kind of dismissed, disregarded, pushed out. And in some cases, there's the care for people that whose job you may be terminating or changing was not in evidence. So anyone who manages people or who controls resources, think and read about human-centered approaches to management and the human resource frame, because I think that thinking is going to be transformative for our field. And then, all I can encourage people to do is to be advocates for themselves, to take initiative, to, when you have an idea or a proposal of how this work might be done more effectively and more carefully, I would attempt to find allies and try to make those changes move forward. It's easier to say than do. It can be quite difficult, but I think what we're seeing is a change where these voices are going to be really important. And I've been asked in other conversations, what's going to happen to museums. And I think that there are probably 3 roads out, and they're going to be different for each person, for each institution. One of them is, I think some organizations are going to retrench and are going to go back to being very collections focused. And it will be about the amazing art, specimens, animals, minerals, whatever the museum is about, but that's really going to be their raison d'etre, and they'll be a little more straightforward and honest about that. I think then there's a category of museums that will really embrace this notion of a revolution and become human-centered at the most fundamental level, in the board, in the leadership, in the decision-making, and for the staff. And then that will show itself as a magnet for the public who recognize a place that values their staff also values the visitor experience and the learning that can happen. And I think a lot of energy and interest and money and support will accrue to those organizations. And then I think third, there are going to be new forms of cultural organization that emerge. It's a time of experimentation. People who have lost their jobs or partially lost their jobs in this field, what I'm seeing, and it's tremendously inspiring, is it's freeing up their energy to create. There are new companies launching, new consultancies launching. People are working in adjacent fields and bringing very creative ideas, museum ideas into these fields. So I think we're in a time where we're going to see some very interesting new models pop up. And so I would say if you have the opportunity to get engaged and be connected to a new experiment of any kind, that now is a time to be testing your skills and ideas in places that might not be as obvious. So that's kind of the 3 roads out. And I think we're going to see museums where humans really are valued at the center. Those will be the ones that emerge successfully.
Well, I like ending on that note, of course. And as we wrap up here, I'll just mention again that we'll include some of these links and resources to some of these rich ideas that you shared with us today, Michelle. And I just want to say I really appreciate you taking the time on the road from in your hotel room while you're doing your work. I appreciate you taking the time today.
Thank you, Paul. I want to appreciate you as well for all that you generously do to facilitate the ongoing conversation about museums and people who love them and use them. You've been really generous to our field, so thank you.
Thanks. That's very kind. All right. Well, best of luck in your endeavors in Little Rock, Arkansas.
Thank you.
Take care.
Take care. Bye now.